opposed? Any abstaining?
Tony has to abstain. You must abstain, Tony.
Motion, minutes are approved. So the next portion of our meeting is going to be a discussion of short-term rentals. We have been tasked with the planning by the city council to look into this issue. Our next agenda item contains two presentations by two of our commissioners. I want to be very clear. The planning commission did not ask anyone to prepare a presentation. These were done by each of the presenters without prior knowledge or at the request of the planning committee. Mrs. Batty's presentation was sent to the commission in January and was provided to the commissioners and the public for informational purposes. And the only presentation at our meeting in January was the one done by our legal counsel framing this situation. In February, a second presentation was sent by Mr. Franklin, and said now there were two presentations. Both Ms. Batty and Mr. Franklin were asked to take their original presentations and edit them for tonight's meeting in order to allow for a 15-minute presentation each. Ms. Batty, would you?
Yeah, can I?
Oh, and in order to keep with the request, our city solicitor will be timing each one. So, are you gonna do this from here? Or?
I think from here, because the light was shining there and it was right at eye level, it's really uncomfortable. Y'all mind if I sit here? I can stand up and you can view me for a moment if you would like, but, as I was gonna say in starting out, but is this on, by the way?
Yeah, you could start the timer, Max.
Okay. You're all our friends. It's a very small place, and I've been really mindful of that in working on this material, doing the research that I've done, and I just want to say there's nothing harder than working with your friends. It's so much easier when it's your client and you don't care so much. So, so I wanted to start out with that. The other thing that I've been concerned about all along is that we have a fair process and we have a data-driven process. You know, there's a lot of emotional issues around these things, and I understand that, but data is always king. So I've been focused on fair and on data. So contents, very quickly, I'm going to tell you a story and give you a recommendation. I'm not going to waste my precious minutes going through this agenda, but you get a sense of where I'm going with this. Slide 3, please. This is a new problem. Short-term rentals are new. They didn't exist before 2007 in the digital form that we know them today. Of course, people have always rented out rooms in their houses all through history. That happened here in Newcastle too, back in the early days of the city. But the phenomenon that we're dealing with today started in 2007 with the first Airbnb rental, which was a room in somebody's house. Cool idea. You could book online, everything was great. It didn't take very long for lots of other things to happen in that process that changed the nature of what a short-term rental was. And in particular, the biggest change was to transition from a room in somebody's house to being a whole house which you could rent out and live in like it's your own house. And this has been happening all over the world. And so the change in the model brought a lot of other changes in social life and in the way cities work, especially small cities. But it brought along a lot of unexpected changes to how neighborhoods and cities worked. And that's why so many entities have jumped in now with different kinds of legislation to regulate them. Next slide, please. The rapid rise in legislation is not an accident. Many places are now trying to fix problems retroactively that they didn't see coming. We are in a different place here. We can start out right and do it right for our city. I have a bunch of examples here, global, US, and Delaware. Y'all can read the slides. I don't have to read them to you. but I was struck especially by a note I got from Ellen Kettner about going to wine country in France and finding the two cities they loved going to completely gutted because all of the residences had turned into short-term rentals and nobody lived there anymore. So there were no more restaurants, there were no more shops. It was just dead off-season. And this was not good for the businesses, it wasn't good for the neighborhoods, it wasn't good for anybody. And I would urge you to read her letter, which I think will be read later, at least I hope so. Next slide, please. The historic area of Newcastle is a unique place. We are not Lewis, Wilmington, Charleston, or the nation of Spain. We are our own place. And this is why the regulation of short-term rentals is done based on zoning at a city level. It has to be that way because every place is different and it has different requirements and different zones that exist already and different constituencies that we'll be talking about in a couple of minutes. I did a couple of Freedom of Information Act requests. Sorry, I'm week 4 of the flu, so you'll have to forgive me. One to the City of Newcastle, which made it clear that the City of Newcastle does not separately track short-term rentals. They are treated as rental properties. So a tourist home in this city is given a license like any other rental. And though there may be some awareness in the city, there's no official registry of which of these short-term rentals comply with the law of having an off-street parking place for every bedroom in the unit. So we're kind of starting from scratch here, but that's okay because we can write rules that cause us to be a little bit more precise about those details. The other thing was that because Chief Majewski was talking about a fire that they had at an unlicensed short-term rental, I tried to get some information about that, and I was turned down by the Goodwill Fire Company on the basis that they're a private company and they don't have to respond to FOIAs. So I was a little disappointed about that. Slide 6, please. I spent a little time on Airbnb over the weekend. It's so much fun. I recommend it to all of you. I found 7 Airbnbs in our city being advertised for immediate availability. 4 of them are in the historic district and 3 are in Greater Newcastle. Obviously, in the current zoning law that we have, the 3 in Greater Newcastle are illegal, but they're still being advertised on Airbnb. And this is a common phenomenon around the world that there's rules and laws that govern the ones that show up and do their filings and pay their fees and everything like that. And then there are all the ones who just sort of operate on the side. And that creates some administrative issues that I'll talk about at the end of this presentation. What I found interesting was the price inside the historic area per night was $149. The price outside the historic area averages $50. And that got me to thinking that maybe, right now we don't allow short-term rentals outside the historic area, but maybe that's something that would help people and be valuable and give homeowners outside the city a chance to earn a few bucks and give people who might want to come to town to deal with a family problem or something unexpected a much less expensive way to deal with it. Slide 7. We hear a lot about tourism. Gotta have more tourism here. There is no tourism problem in the city of Newcastle. We have a museum attendance problem. Some of you here are involved with those museums and you know that. But otherwise, almost 3/4 of the patrons of the businesses in this city come from outside the city. So it's not like people don't come here, right? And I think we need to orient our minds in that way. We don't have to have all these things happening so that people come and tourist here. They're here already doing that. And the Spirit of Christmas, one event alone in December of last year attracted 5,000 people. That's not trivial. That brought a lot of money into town. It made money for all the businesses and the restaurants in town. And it was a great event. And it also made money which can be used to develop the town as the founders of that event chose to do it. Slide 8, please. In my previous presentation, I've had a lot of questions and I've narrowed it down to 3 that we need to address. Should the commercial zone have different regulations from the residence zone? what regulations would make everybody the happiest, and should we allow the rest of the city to have short-term rentals as well? And what I'm seeing in my own view of this, after all the research I've done, is that we should allow them in the historic commercial district, subject to certain restrictions. And I'll talk about that in a minute. It is extremely important that our renter ecosystem that is within the historic commercial districts. There are many, many people, they're your friends and neighbors that you see at the Sycamore and at Zolli's and places like that, who live in those places. And we need to protect their ability to live there and not be thrown out for short-term rental. So yes, with conditions. I'll talk about the zoning that I think, or the coding for the zones that I think we need as we go forward. And I believe that we should allow short-term rentals outside the city under certain circumstances. Next slide. There's a really exhaustive playbook for short-term rental regulations. Just about any condition you can think of has already been implemented, and I found a whole bunch more. Some of the ones, of course, Newcastle's current restriction is a tourist house has to have 1 off-street parking per bedroom. But other interesting ones are maximum number of days to rent to 1 individual, usually 31 or less, limit of number of people, number of bedrooms, kitchen access, and interestingly, insurance indemnification of the city in the event if anything goes wrong in your rental. Next slide. So this is the summary of what I'm recommending for the historic commercial zone. And it's a little bit hard to read it all up there. Oh, see, the font went completely gone. Yeah, 5 minutes, thank you. A permit, a fire inspection, a local caretaker, a ban on corporate ownership with the exception of single proprietor LLCs, fine structure, apartment or home only, no temporary structures, occupancy restrictions, restrictions on the number of rooms, and the requirement still to have 1 off-street parking per bedroom, because we don't want anything to flood our streets with parking. We have enough problems with that as well, and indemnification of city and taxpayers. Maybes are collect taxes. I'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide, 11. For both the residence zone and Greater Newcastle, my recommendation is to have the same thing, permit and license, no more than 31 days. Owner occupied. The owner must be present when a room is rented to guests. And the reason for this is that the residential area is a residential area, it's not a commercial area. And so a house which is empty that somebody goes into and stays in is a commercial venture. It's not a home residence venture. So I would suggest we stick to that definition. All of the other things are the same as the commercial area, with the one important exception that there's no requirement for off-street parking. If your guest comes over, they park on the street. If your Airbnb guest comes over, they park on the street. Slide 13, please. An important consideration here is the Terry House. The Terry House became a hotel over 100 years ago. It has 7 rooms in it. It does not have off-street parking. It's currently licensed as a rental, as a tourist home. I think we need to define what that is as a hotel and create rules for that. But the Terry House must be cared for in this process. It's an incredibly important structure and presence in our city, and a big contribution. Slide 14. We need definitions. A lot of the things I've described can be covered in definitions. They don't have to be identified in specific lines of code. I'm short on time, so I'll let you read these things. But update short-term rental to include most of the conditions that I've talked about and clarify the zones. Remove the antiquated designation of tourist house from city code. Remove rooming house and boarding house, with the exception of recovery type homes, which I don't know how we would solve that, but we need advice. Define a hotel or inn to the extent we can, stopping them from being subjected to big taxes, which the state of Delaware may do, and clean up the code. Lastly, slide 15. Your tax dollars are paying for this to happen. This is not a free activity. Somebody in the city will have to monitor and manage all of this. Give the license, maintain the license, make sure the fire code inspection happens. Collect fines. By the way, try to collect fines. It's not very easy to do. So that costs money too. Scoffers need legal action, that costs money too. We need to determine fee structures which support the costs of doing this in our city. It's not free. We need a process in the city to identify how we're gonna license and support these things. The fire department needs a specific inspection so that we don't have fires in these short-term rentals. Many cities have tried to tax short-term rentals, and it is difficult because it then involves the city tracking every single hour or every single day that a short-term rental is used, and that's not feasible for a little city like ours. It is possible that we could get the online booking agencies to collect taxes for us, and that's what some cities do. That's an administrative challenge as well. Finally, the effect of the costs on the police and fire department of these things is unknown. I couldn't get information from Goodwill Fire, and should there be enforcement requirements involving police or fire, that's additional cost which is borne by taxpayers. I think that's it. But what I've tried to do here is show you end to end where we are, what it's gonna cost us, what it's gonna cost us as taxpayers, a process that's helpful to people, that lets people who own their homes do things with their homes, which the law provides, but it prevents commercial activity from taking place in a residential area, and I think that's critical for the longevity of our city. And I thank you all so much for reading all my stuff and listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Our next presenter is Stephen Franklin. Are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Max? Thank you.
So good evening and thank you for attending tonight's Newcastle Planning Commission meeting. I'm Dr. Stephen Franklin. I'm talking to you about current issues in tourism, short-term rentals, efficacy, and solutions. For tonight, I'll be using the term short-term rental, not Airbnb, not Vrbo, not Booking.com. Those are platforms.
Excuse me, can you speak up a little bit? I can't hear you.
You can't?
Into the microphone.
Can you hear me now?
That's better.
Okay, I got angle it then. What I was saying was I'm using the term short-term rentals throughout tonight's presentation. Airbnb, Vrbo, Booking.com, those are platforms by which hosts and guests connect to identify short-term rental availability. And the concept of bed and breakfast, the Terry House. That is a phenomenon that exists in between short-term rentals and the traditional hotel, motel lodging. Next slide, please. Again, first of all, we are a tourist community. I know sometimes we don't like to admit that, but we are. And we are not a beachfront community. I know in previous presentations, both at the City Council in November and again in January, there was reference to Lewis, Rehoboth Beach, and other cities. Those comparisons don't really compare to us, don't really apply to us. We are not that type of community. Our product is a historical product, based given the historical context of our early nation. And our draw primarily are cultural tourists, those who want to experience the art, the history, and so forth. They're not here necessarily to be a party crowd or to look for a sunset or revel. The extant literature talks about historical immersion. And this is simply where it allows guests and visitors to actually immerse themselves, at least momentarily, in the uniqueness of Newcastle and get a chance to actually experience what Newcastle is all about. If I probably should go again. Next slide. So this is a recap of concerns that were expressed at the November 12th City Council meeting and at the January Planning Commission meeting. The terms and ideas that were expressed was a loss of community feel, a loss of affordable housing, decrease in property values, and parking concerns. There was also a language that was talking about revising the zoning code to provide a clear definition of short-term rentals, which I do agree with. And there was also talk of removing the tourist home terminology as a matter of right. Now we'll be talking about the concept of as a matter of right in more detail towards the end. Next slide, please. With regards to loss of community feel, the literature, the extant literature compared short-term rentals not only in the US but also in Europe, large and small cities, and it simply did not support the claim of loss of community feel. Again, unlike the communities that were referenced previously, our tourism is primarily event-based, and for the most part, it lasts maybe a day, maybe two. So in comparison to the beach communities and their extensive rental season simply is not relevant. Tourists, the literature points out, who come here want to kind of go off the beaten path, and they want to interact with locals so they can better understand and educate themselves on the culture, the historical heritage, and the traditions of the city. So the literature actually points to short-term rentals actually serving to actually enhance community feel as tourists get a chance to interact with locals. Next slide, please. The loss of affordable housing. Concerns regarding the loss of affordable or long-term rentals are misplaced. The extant literature points to a tipping point of when short-term rentals exceed more than 5% of the total rental housing stock. And when this phenomenon begins to occur, then you may see an impact on long-term rentals. As it stands right now, short-term rentals comprise slightly more than 1% of Newcastle's housing stock. And as Newcastle is not really a hotbed for vacant vacation homes, concerns regarding tourist homes or whole home rentals doesn't really mesh with reality. The industry trends towards occupancy for short-term rentals at around 63%. This includes both traditional hotels and short-term rentals. The current rate of occupancy here in Newcastle is between 30 and 50%. And this is based upon city data and conversations with short-term rental owners here in Newcastle. And basically what it points to, some literature pointed to that the fact that short-term rentals actually provide prospective or existing residents a chance to do like a preview rental before they commit to a more of a long-term rental. And concerns and criticism regarding short-term rentals as a cause of rent increase, it has been shown that overall, the hue and cry is much larger than the actual rent increase itself. Next slide, please. Decrease in property values. That was something that was expressed quite significantly both at the City Council meeting, at the Planning Commission meeting, and actually again, the literature points to just the opposite, on the contrary. Short-term rentals provide homeowners a way to share the cost of ownership while increasing the state in which homes are maintained. So instead of deferring maintenance or putting it off to later to a rainy day, short-term rentals tend to promote positive home upkeep and thereby maintaining or actually enhancing property values. The Association of Lodging Professionals pointed to the fact that 79% of short-term rentals are actually owner-occupied, with 70% being actually owned by couples. So the concern of short-term rentals being done through a vacant or absentee owner, again, that doesn't seem to mesh with reality. What makes short-term rentals unique is the personal services that they provide. And again, owners typically live on premises and they actually act as a host to their guests. The parking concerns that were expressed and the need for off-street parking and so forth essentially is a false narrative. We live in a colonial town where few homes have off-street parking with garages, primarily because there was no need for off-street parking or garages in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. So there is none. There is more than sufficient existing parking that actually exists in the city for short-term rentals. There's parking on 2nd Street off of Bull Hill Park. There's parking on 3rd Street near Battery Park. There's parking on Delaware Street, there's parking off Chestnut Street. A short-term rental owner simply has to tell his guests where parking is available. So again, the concerns around parking, I think, are a bit off base and again, do not mesh with reality. Next slide, please. Some of the possible solutions and realities. Policies that want to curtail short-term rental housing are of a bygone era and often they're without warrant. The literature points that there are three common approaches that were found both in Europe and in the US, large and small cities. That is total bans, which led to some legal issues, laissez-faire, which is more the European approach, which is more common in European cities, I should say, and then having quantitative limitations with some restrictions. The literature points to short-term rentals actually being a boon for government revenue that increase tourism-related activities, and again, they provide income to our hosts. Studies show that cultural tourists, those who come to see and visit us, tend to spend more, they tend to stay longer, and they tend to visit more often. And while most tourists are baby boomers, there is a significant population, the millennials. Research is now showing that 73% of millennials want to travel to destinations that are filled with art, culture, and history. That kind of sounds like Newcastle to me. Next slide, please. These next two slides give you some reference points. These are not absolute numbers simply because all the guests who come to our city don't check into the visitor center or don't identify themselves as being tourists and visitors. These numbers came from, yes, I have
5 minutes.
Okay. These numbers were supplied by the Newcastle Visitor Center and the Newcastle Historical Society. And basically what it's showing, and this spans actually 2016 to 2024. I've only showed those 5 years because before that, 2016 and 2017, visitation numbers were very, very low. 2019, the year before COVID, shows that was our high mark. We were just over 4,119 visitors per those who actually signed in and identified as being guests and visitors. Since that time, our numbers have not rebounded to more than 50%. I did not show or list the numbers for 2020 and 2021 simply because in those years, we didn't top 600, we did not top 600 visitors. In 2020, we had 245 according to the Visitor Center, and we had 632 in 2021. So again, these numbers are not absolute, but it gives us a reference point with regards to the tourism that comes to our city. And as reflected by the occupancy rates of our existing bed and breakfasts and our short-term rentals, our tourism is seasonal. And this next slide shows you that through May through December, those are our high seasons, specifically May, June, August, October, December. These are the months when typically we see visitation that exceeds 1,000 guests per month. And again, these numbers are not absolute. Once again, everyone that comes to our city does not register at the visitor center. Everyone doesn't identify themselves as a guest, but it does give you a frame of reference. The reality of it is that for Newcastle to remain culturally and regionally important, we must embrace tourism with short-term rentals being a viable option. Failure to do so will lead to Newcastle's decline, such as Delaware City and or Odessa. And Newcastle continues to remain tourist ambivalent rather than actively promoting tourism. The support of museums and shops that give us our charm will struggle and eventually close. As a point of reference, the Newcastle Historical Society is struggling with this very issue as we speak with regards to the lack of tourism and how they're going to manage and continue. Next slide, please. Some possible solutions. First of all, the concern about the proliferation of short-term rentals in either the commercial or the residential district is not necessarily based in reality, simply because short-term rentals are not as lucrative as everybody thinks they are. With regards to bed and breakfast, of which we have one, the Cherry House, There's a total of 7 in the entire state of Delaware. So one is here, you know where the other 6 are at, downstate. Running a short-term rental, and you can talk to anyone who actually owns one that's very labor intensive. Frequently you see the owners doing the work themselves. I can attest to that. I've walked past as I'm walking my dog. I can attest to seeing the owner of the Terry House actually laying brick to expand his patio in the backyard. And so basically what you have is that the short-term owners are trying to find a balance between, providing amenities for their guests while also trying to avoid burnout. And because of the factors that make short-term rentals so labor intensive and not as lucrative as everyone feels or thinks, that these factors themselves will self-police and contribute to density controls. And they will prevent the hotelization of neighborhoods that some of us are worried about. Next slide, please.
1 minute.
Okay. Possible solutions, very simply, limit the number of licenses. There are currently 12 in the city of Newcastle. Establish clear guidelines and requirements. Develop a common sense and enforceable ordinance. And I say common sense and enforceable. Ordinances that are overly complex, instead of promoting compliance, they promote non-compliance. Enforcement being done online. As it stands to advertise a short-term rental, be it Airbnb, Vrbo, you must go online to advertise it. So list your license number. You don't have a license, then we know therefore it's not legal, and then there's a fine that can come into play. Policies that trend on public policy that impinge on the matter of right, I would suggest we tread very lightly on that issue. Such policies will be in direct violation of the 4th and 5th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution, and it also invokes inverse condemnation. Catalina Island, I want to share very quickly, is an island off the coast of Long Beach, California. It's a very small community.
I think you're done.
Okay,
Sorry.
no problem.
Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate that. And now our city solicitor is going to lead a discussion regarding the potential path forward on recommendations for short-term rental or tourist home.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't live here, and you guys are a recommending body, but I have the very unfortunate task of trying to take everything that you say and try to put them into a draft ordinance. I didn't know how to do that. We have some direction from council, which I went over at the last meeting. I tried to come up with a yes/no chart. It's the best I can do. By the way, no matter what ordinance I put together, you guys are all gonna hate parts of it. I'll guarantee you. I just want to try to get the best, as right as I can, the best as I can. And you guys represent as a group for a recommendation. Council's the one who's gonna actually adopt. They have the ability to change whatever y'all recommend, which is perfectly fine. But I gotta have to start somewhere, and I gotta get the view of the commission. So I put a yes/no chart in there, and I figured we could just start with some quick discussions because I think some of the questions go quickly. And I do the absolutist ones first. And the question I have for the council is, do you desire to recommend changing any of the current laws regarding short-term rentals?
Yes.
Okay, so that's a yes. So, do you recommend banning short-term rentals in all districts?
No.
Perfect. That would have made it very easy if the answer for one of those was to say yes, but that's why we have all the other questions, right? So, do you desire to recommend defining tourist home, traditional bed and breakfast, and short-term rentals differently?
Yes.
Everybody, yes? Any dissenters amongst it? All right. And I ask this question because it may make it easier for me. And this is not a yes or no question. But is there a particular jurisdiction short-term rental ordinance that you would like to use as a model for Newcastle's jurisdiction? And if so, what jurisdiction?
The city of Denver actually has a very short one-paragraph city ordinance that's very straightforward and easily to be enforced.
What does it say?
I don't have the city of Denver's code. in front of me.
Do you have a copy?
Do you
Can you
have a
read
copy?
it?
Yes. did primary residences, so the people who are actually who will let me talk, let's try that again. We did primary residences, so the people who are actually conducting it in their homes could rent out their home and be away for a month at a time or however long they travel. We feel it probably would take a big toll on the rental market and the housing market if we did a tiered system where you have an investment property license as well.
So that, at least to me, is much more of a sort of a little bit of a mission statement, but it doesn't help me with my it doesn't help me with the definitions. I'm not going against the mission statement, right? But I need to get some definitions in there. In my chart, and this is just a start, I try to give a couple of definitions of what a short-term rental is. There's as many definitions as you could think of, but is one or the other of those definitions, do they seem to get to where we need to, or is there another or different definition that would be beneficial?
The reason I did the work that I did was to look at all the potential conditions and to try to put together something that would work for the historic commercial zone, and then basically for the rest of Newcastle, which is a new idea. We haven't discussed that really as a group, but based on what I found, why would we fight letting people in the rest of the city do the same things? But the problem with your definition, and the reason I think we need to do it as more of a line item like this, is that we start to argue with every sentence. I think we need to look at the conditions and identify which conditions we want, and then you write
I'm
it
doing my
out.
best.
Yes.
I'll do my best, right? So I did go through, and as you can tell by my yes or no question, I do try to get to that later. I was trying to think of a generalized definition, right, that says this is what a short-term rental is. Yes, I agree with you, if I may, I agree with you, like 30 days, 31 days, what's the definition? We're gonna get to that.
That's irrelevant.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah, but all or any portion thereof of a residential dwelling, it already assumes that the zones are the same. What we've seen is that we have a commercial zone which has some conditions that could be significantly different to the residential zone. And to have one definition for both zones doesn't work, in my opinion.
So, I don't know what the other members think, but you could do a different definition that went into each commercial or residential that would be different.
That was my recommendation.
What are the thoughts? I have not seen that done, but there's no reason you can't do it.
What would the differences be?
The difference is owner occupied versus not. That's the primary difference, and then the parking.
So if that's the difference, I think I could maybe slice that in just a different way. If we can get to a definition of what exactly is a short-term rental, then it's probably easier to have different requirements in each district for the short-term rental. But I understand the issue now, so I can try to do that when I write it.
But also, I think that the definition you're proposing hardwires us into all or some. And in fact, we're saying the definitions should be distinctly different for the commercial versus the residential.
Maybe we're having a.
But, wait a minute, just clarify for me. So you said the two differences would be owner occupied versus non-owner occupied?
Correct.
So you're saying, and I'm assuming you're meaning the non-owner occupied will be in the commercial zone?
Correct.
So basically you're saying anybody in the residential zone couldn't do short-term rentals?
No, not at all. No, they just have to be present.
Oh,
You
they
rent a
just-
room out in their house.
Okay, so
Which
they
is-
can't rent their whole house out?
No, they have to be present.
So I think I can write that. I can write that if that's what the other commission members.
I don't agree with that.
I don't
Yeah,
agree with that
I
either.
don't agree with that either.
Okay.
I don't think it needs to be owner occupied.
Why not?
Why does it have to be?
Because it it means that the owner is actually, well, first and foremost, if the owner is not there, it's a commercial activity, and commercial activities don't belong in residential areas. They just don't.
So if I'm going to take, let's just say, a short-term job where I'm gone for 45 days from my home, and my husband and I go and leave, there's nobody else in the house, and I wanna rent my house, and tell me I can't, because I want someone else.
That's not what we're talking about here.
You just sat there and said, somebody is in, you're in the home with the
That's
person.
not a short-term rental, that's, and if we need special legislation.
What if I want to rent it for 10 days at a time?
It's not. It's been shown over and over, and I was disappointed in Stephen's presentation that he talked about sources, but he identified no sources, and most of his data was inaccurate. I've provided a huge amount of data showing that non-owner occupied residences end up causing huge social problems in the environment.
So I would very much like to.
Actually, I will have to.
I'm gonna let you respond, but I'm gonna just say this. I had to go on a diet because a doctor made me, and I'm very grumpy today. And therefore, we are not going to have a tax on other folks' data in any way. We're gonna have a discussion.
Fine, but I still like to see the sources.
Actually, the sources were noted on the slides, in case you didn't, in case you know how to read. It was actually listed on the slides. I did not include the citation slides. That would require 2 more slides to identify about 35 sources. I did mention them, I did list them on my slides. So my data is not incorrect.
So,
With regards to the, again, eliminating or talking about whole home rental, I'm going to caution us once again. The 4th and 5th Amendments kind of say we can't do that. The 4th Amendment, we all understand, is against unreasonable search and seizures. We think of 5th Amendment as protecting us against self-incrimination, but actually, the last line, actually the last 2 lines of the 5th Amendment very clearly state, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And this goes back to inverse condemnation. Inverse condemnation is an instance where the government has taken property or impacted property rights without utilizing the condemnation process and therefore without providing just compensation for the taking. Inverse condemnation applies both to physical invasions of private property and to so-called regulatory taking, which is what we're talking about when we talk about eliminating something. These instances in which the government has regulated the use of property in a manner so as to constitute a constructive taking thereof. And that comes from, Cynthia, Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Mayhem, 1922.
So I don't know that I agree with the characterization of the takings clause. I do think, and I'm not trying to get into a debate over it, but here's what I want to know from the commission, and I think it's a simple answer. And the first question will be, would you like an owner-occupied limitation in the residential district? And so I have 1 yes. Do I have any other yeses on that question? So then I'm not gonna write it with an owner-occupied limitation. So, one,
How about?
hang on, this gentleman's,
I have a question. So, this is my first meeting. The residential district, is that defined to the historic?
it is not, no, sir.
Okay, all right.
And I'm trying to speak in generalities tonight because we're gonna get a draft together and then we're gonna pick it apart. As I mentioned, I will get everything wrong when we do it, but I need somewhere to start to try to get it there. So, okay, and then I assume from the commission that you do not wanna require owner occupied in the commercial districts. Is that correct?
Yeah, I said no to that too.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'm just trying to build this.
So let me rephrase. Should corporations be allowed to come into the residential area, buy out houses and rent them out on short term?
How are you gonna define that?
By corporate LLC ownership.
Yeah, but you could have a husband and wife as a two-person LLC. You could have 3 friends go together and form an LLC.
And buy multiple houses and rent them out?
Sure.
That is what has damaged so many historic cities and why there's so many rules and regulations globally, especially in historic areas, to stop that from happening. It guts the city.
Max, are we allowed to make laws against who can own properties?
So the answer to that question is no, but, right?
We got it.
Right? But you guys are gonna come up with some issues tonight, I'm trying to get where they are, and then I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna take a look at sort of some of the more thorny issues. Can you limit corporate, who can own a corporate with respect to ownership and this kind of thing? I know owner and occupied are okay. I don't know the answer to your question, so I'm not going to try to answer it today. But as I take these issues as I go through, the idea is I do the best I can to write an ordinance. When those issues are flagged, then I try to find a case or two that helps you out. So I don't have all the answers, don't pretend to have all the answers tonight.
And I'm not advocating, I'm just saying, how are you gonna monitor that? How can you even create an ordinance to that?
Chris?
No.
I just wanted to add, just tag it on to what Max was saying. Part of our job is to, find the right balance, but we also have to find the right administrative capability. The administrative capabilities of the jurisdiction has to come into play when we are writing an ordinance. So I've been in a lot of places that have very high hopes when they write ordinances, but ultimately they end up being unimplementable for various reasons. And I'm not saying that the staff is inadequate, but something like that would require perhaps different administrative capabilities and research than a small city like Newcastle would have. So I just caution us in that there's a lot of great ideas out there, and that is an issue that is impacting urban areas across the country. But for a small staff to try to figure out, what's a corporation and when it was transferred and what's what would be of a concern of mine as a planner.
But if the owner is living there, and they leave for, say we take Kristen's example, and they leave for 10 days and they let somebody rent for 10 days, the owner owns that place, right?
Even if it was an LLC, what if they appointed somebody on the representative, who's to stay there?
Can you guys please use the microphones because it's hard to hear?
Sure.
Thank you.
So, they were discussing, and because I'm gonna move off of this, but essentially they were discussing sort of the difficulty it would be to determine corporate ownership. I think we can move past that, at least for drafting purposes. Go ahead.
I would just recommend that the unit, building, domicile, whatever, either be owned or the property manager be a resident of the city.
That's a good one.
Some people buy a house, they're going to retire here to it. Maybe somebody here within the city would then manage it and be a contact within the city. So maybe it's not necessarily you have to be a resident and own the home, but have somebody within the city managing it, if that's not the case.
Is that the will of the remainder of the planning commission?
I'm thinking
That's my idea I'm throwing out.
just thinking that's restrictive. Now, if you said like Newcastle County or the state, I might be a little more manageable.
I think it should just be somebody that's definitely,
It's in the
people
city.
can,
Contact.
yes, if there should be any issues.
I've seen a number of city regulations which require either the owner or the manager to live in the city, to be available in the city. So that's not
Well,
impossible.
what size cities are those?
All different sizes. Yeah, I didn't bring all my research with me, I've seen a lot of my work, but I've read dozens to hundreds of descriptions of laws, and I've seen it over and over.
Okay, and just to kind of flesh this out, Newcastle's really small. So, somebody who lived 2 miles outside of the city limits,
No. Because you gotta set a guideline sometime.
Yes.
You're either a stakeholder or you're not.
I just want to point out, in the city of Lewis rental licensing agreement, there is a note about does an owner have to be present, does the owner have to be present during the rental? And it says an owner does not have to be present for the duration of their guest stay, however, a local contact must be available. Local contact means that the individual designated by the license holder to perform obligations under this ordinance and serve as the contact person for issues relating to a short-term rental. The designated contact must be available 24 hours a day to accept phone calls and respond physically to the short-term rental within a reasonable time period, not to exceed 2 hours when a short-term rental is rented and occupied. So something similar to that could potentially be a compromise between owner occupied and, you know, someone living within the city, some similar language to that possibly.
Why don't I start with that? There's 1,000 things you can do. You could do 5 miles from the city, 10 miles from the city. There's all those iterations. But I think that's a nice way, just hearing the banter to sort of get something to start with as far as drafting. I know that there was some question, I know Cynthia raised about the Terry House, and that's what I was trying to get to with the definition of bed and breakfast. So they stay out of being a hotel and stay out of that. Does anyone, we can tinker with my definition, because I don't know the Terry House nearly as well as y'all do, but is there any objection to establishments like the Terry House being treated as a bed and breakfast instead of a tourist home?
I had no objection. Actually, I was under the impression that already was being treated as a bed and breakfast.
No, it's a tourist.
It's a tourist home as I understand it. Okay, and then,
quick question, because you have stays more than 7 nights, is that currently in effect? The 7-night minimum?
no,
Okay.
no, and we could toy with that a little bit. I have a better understanding based upon Cynthia's presentation about what the Terry House does now. So my definition is incorrect, that's why I'm trying to move it on, but I'll try to.
Well, let me explain the issue with the concerns me about the Terry House. There's another property in the city on Delaware Street, it's at 400 Delaware Street, which is, everyone in this room knows what I'm talking about. It's a beautiful, big, historic house, which is crumbling. One day, that house is gonna come on the market. And what I had suggested was that we create a category, because it would be an obvious choice to make a bed and breakfast in that place. It's such a mess inside, it would be the cheapest solution to make money out of the property, and it's located in the commercial district. But it would need to go before the Board of Adjustment, in my opinion, because you have to consider fire safety, you have to consider parking, you have to consider all these other things which are already solved in the Terry House.
So there's 2 sort of mechanisms you can use for that are established Delaware law. One is a special exception, which you could use for bed and breakfasts that aren't currently existing, and that is an approval by the Board of Adjustment. There's a second one, which I just got a decision on from the Delaware Supreme Court today, related
Just
to
in time.
conditional use permits, and so those are granted by the council. So those are 2 different mechanisms. I believe Newcastle's code pretty much stays with the special exception, and I wouldn't add that in. But you could do that for certain special exceptions. A special exception or conditional use is a permitted use that has certain conditions that are attached to it, which are usually written into the code and some health, safety, and welfare things. So understanding that that is a concern, we could certainly write that
Okay.
in. We could have that part of it. So moving on, because I don't want to keep us here all night. There's lots of folks who want to talk.
And by the way, would we allow another Terry House-like structure to be, to take place in the residence area? Our house was a rooming house, folks. 8 people lived in our house before the Applebee's.
I think you set the definition of whatever it is, and if you meet the definition, then you're gonna get your special exception, you can do it.
But that's why the zoning is important. Because are we gonna allow that in the residence area, or are we gonna limit that to the,
So I have,
commercial district?
I have upcoming questions on exactly that issue. So it's my recommendation that if we're gonna do this with short-term rentals and bed and breakfasts, that we get rid of, just because it's hard to shoehorn it in the definition of tourist home.
Thank you.
Does anybody object to that
I endorse
recommendation
it.
from, well, it's just from a writing perspective, it's hard to keep it in there. So, the next thing that was talked about at various times was, you know, what's the rental limitation, right? So, because if you rent a property for 365 days, it's not a short-term rental, it's a long-term rental, 180 days, whatever that may be. And so you need to put some time frames in relating to what is a short-term rental time, 7 days, 14 days, 30 days, you know, put them all in there, or a bed and breakfast. Is there a particular time designation? It doesn't have to be any of the ones listed here where we want to start, where a short-term rental is less than 7, less than 14, less than 20.
So here's,
Sorry, I know you can't hear me if I don't use this. My question is, you have somebody who is either like an attorney that's been assigned to a Delaware case and is gonna be here for 3 months doing their case. Or somebody's parent is now ill, and so they're gonna be here for 3 or 4 months trying to take care of that parent. We're saying they can't be in one of these places because they have to be out in X number of days. I wanna know how we address that.
It's for tourists, it's not for people solving long-term life problems.
So you're gonna say that you can't stay in any of the houses in Newcastle unless you're a tourist?
So I don't think the intent is to prevent someone from a longer term lease, whatever term that may be, 3 months, 6 months, whatever, right? I think the intent for the definition of short-term rental and all the licensing requirement is to sort of pigeonhole the number of days, you know, Airbnb, Vrbo, whatever that is, right? And so the intent certainly is not to take away one's right to rent your property for 3, 4, 5 months to to whomever. I'm sorry, I wanted to finish that thought before I got to your
That's
question.
okay. What I want to say is that there is a unit right next door to my restaurant, and there are times where people exceed the 30 days. There's two. One of the properties oftentimes had rented to traveling nurses. So they may be on assignment for 2 months and then they leave. Now, I'm on Delaware Street, which is I believe, is the commercial property.
Your side is, yes.
Yeah, so I see that. These people don't cause any problems. They're professionals and they have a need, and these 2 units supply a need for these particular people.
So I'm gonna give this some thought and drafting, and again, I will not get it right. Just so everybody knows, I won't get it right, but I'll try to put some thought in to sort of where the breaking point is between a short-term rental and a more traditional rental that's less than a year,
Yeah.
right? So there's a breaking point there, maybe we can discuss
The
that.
state of Delaware defines a short-term rental as 31 days.
31 days, yes. But you guys, under your local zoning code, can do as you wish. So, all my,
I was just gonna suggest it should be 6 months or less, just to me, because
is it short-term rental?
That's not short-term.
it's temporary.
That's not a tourist visit.
Let me see if I can parse this. I get your point, so let me see if I can parse this for you. I guarantee I won't get it right, but at least I'll create some debate. So, now, I've listed here.
Sir, I had a quick
Oh,
question.
yes, I'm sorry. I didn't see you go in the mic, I'm
It's
sorry.
okay. So with the Terry House, what is the length of stay now?
I'm sorry, I do not know. I
There's
did
no
not-
restrictions on it.
There's no restrictions
No,
on it
present,
at all,
no.
so you can
Not-
stay as long
Under
as
the
you
current
like.
law, the only restriction is that you have to have a parking place.
Okay, that was just for my edification. And also, for the agreements that will be created for those that are renting out their properties, there's the option to renew, if you will. So we could actually set a limitation for the short term, period, and then if that option is available, so I'm on board with that.
It's an
piece of
excellent,
it,
it's an excellent idea.
But I just wanted to bring that clarity.
Understood. I think that's nice. And so again, I gotta get something to draft to start with. So if you look here, these are all the districts, zoning districts, page 3 in the city, which I thought you would have. I don't think you have any in the industrial districts, for example, right? So is there in other words, is there any district where we want to preclude short-term rentals?
I don't think
I
so.
say no.
I would say no.
Okay, we have, I think, unanimous. Okay, here we go. Do you want to preclude short-term rentals in multifamily housing units or condos or apartments?
Subject to the other rules, no.
Wouldn't the apartments, be, regulated by the building owners?
They could be, yes. The point being that just like you do with your house, or if you had a house and you had it as an Airbnb, you could do your apartment as an Airbnb too, because you weren't gonna be there, weren't gonna be, subject to the rules, with private restrictions, obviously.
The thing I'd be a little more, I would think you would need to own it in order to rent it. If you're in an apartment, by definition, you don't own it. So I think the comment about, does the whole apartment complex have their own rules, but,
You could sublet. It wouldn't
yeah,
function.
well, but generally only can sublet with permission from,
I think I can address that.
okay.
Most condominiums and other legal structures like that will not allow short-term rentals.
There are some, depending on how their condo documents are written,
Yeah.
some that are older that are under the Property Act don't have that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, the one I owned didn't have that.
I'm not gonna, one thing I'm not gonna
Oh,
do, I'm not
did
gonna
you?
put the city in a position where the city has to determine the condo rules to determine if it's legal. Cause that puts us in
So maybe
enforcing
we
private.
say no
condo.
condos.
Well, again, I think you,
So what I heard was ownership, right?
as long as
And
you
then if
own.
the condo people say you can't do this, that's between them and the owner, not
Yeah.
them.
Yeah, then it's the condominium association that's enforcing that as opposed to the city. Okay.
So there was some,
What's the difference about multifamily housing then? I guess I'm confused what that means.
a multifamily housing could be various, it could be a fourplex of condos, it could be a duplex, it could be any of those things. I just put it in here for completeness, but I think I have sort of the tenor of the planning commission on sort of where we wanna go, at least for a first draft. One of the things that was discussed is, at least in one of the prior presentations, or somewhere along the line, some districts said you can only have 5%, 10% of the houses within each district be an Airbnb or be a short-term rental. Is there an appetite among the planning commission, at least at this time, to have a percentage sort of allotment? Like the historic district, you can no more than 5%, and the commercial district, no more than 5%.
Yes.
I agree with that. That takes away the ability for one district to monopolize all the licenses.
I would disagree with that. I think basically, again, the fact that they're not as lucrative as many seem to feel, I think it's gonna self-police. And if you have, short-term rentals that are proximal to where most people will probably wanna be in the first place, the historic area, I think it will kind of take care of itself. I don't think you need to actually limit, or say you can't do this, you can't do that.
So since we have a split sort of amongst the commission, why don't I just draw a blank there when I write it up? And then we can debate about what that percentage should be, because I don't have enough research on sort of saying the usual is 5 or 10% or whatever that may be.
And would it be a percentage of the entire housing population or the rental population?
You could do it either way. I would say it would,
These dwelling units.
I would say dwelling
Okay.
units is the way that I was envisioning it.
Okay, that's fine, I'm just asking.
So next sort of thought process that we had was parking requirements. And, you can have all kinds of parking requirements, or you can have none. And I know, so, tell me if we feel that there should, because currently there's a parking spot, I think it's a parking spot per bedroom. Did I get that
That's
right?
correct.
Did I get that right?
Yes.
So, should there be in our draft ordinance a parking requirement
And is that an off-street parking?
off-street? The way it's
So that means you
currently
like have to have a driveway?
That's correct. The way it's currently written, and the question is whether or not, in as part of this ordinance, you wanna require, parking.
It's by zone.
Does Terry House have?
No.
They do not.
Yes, sir.
With regards to the parking and the requirement, are you saying that the actual property has to have parking right there, or can it be parking that is proximal?
No such rule for that.
I'm
Somewhere.
I'm asking you whether or not you would like to recommend that there be an on-site parking space or not. Otherwise, then they would have to utilize the other spaces.
Excuse me, the current regulation doesn't say on-site, it just says an off-site parking. Believe me, I've looked at it very carefully.
That implies the same thing.
Imply is irrelevant. If you have a parking space and you rent it from somebody 2 doors down who's got 4 garages, which is a condition on the
What-
Strand, then you have a parking place off-site.
Whether or not, I would interpret that as a dedicated parking space, which we'd have to have some dominion and control over, but that's
Could be.
irrelevant for this
You rent
discussion.
a parking, a lot of people here rent parking spaces from other dwellings,
Right.
right?
But
So,
the question before us is, do we wanna have a similar requirement as we're writing this ordinance that you have to have, and I'll call it a dedicated parking space?
No,
in some
I would
zones,
say no.
yes.
no.
No.
Sounds like no.
Okay, so the answer,
Excuse me. I say yes.
Okay.
In the historic, commercial district, there must be an off-site or an off-street parking.
Then you shut the Terry House down.
so I'm gonna keep the discussion here.
Terry House is accepted, we've
Yeah.
made a condition that it's accepted.
So we're gonna,
No.
I'm gonna keep this discussion amongst the council, there will be, or excuse me, amongst the planning commission, because this is time for discussion of what you guys want. The public will certainly have its opportunity in public comment. I'm going to, for present purposes, say no, and we can continue the debate later, but I think the majority of the heads nodding say we don't wanna have that requirement. Licensing requirements. So licensing requirements are always interesting, but it would be my recommendation, and if you notice I don't recommend much, that you have to have a business license and a rental license. At minimum, is there another type of license that folks think that should be put on a short-term rental or a bed and breakfast?
So why would you put a business license on a bed and breakfast if someone was renting a room in their house?
That's what I'm asking you, right?
Yeah.
That's what I'm here, this is for your discussion. Generally, if you have a business, you have a business
You
license.
have to have a business license, yeah, the state requires it.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So, what I'm thinking is the bed and breakfast such as the Terry House, we're assuming operates as a business, so I would assume it has a business license
I would make that assumption as well,
currently.
yes.
Short-term rentals, from what I'm hearing, are often not business owned, so I don't think it's necessary to necessarily require that of a short-term rental, but of like a bed and breakfast. I don't know if that makes a difference.
I would beg to differ
Yeah, I
simply
differ too.
because the state defines a requirement for a business license, whether you operate as a sole proprietor, an LLC, or a corporation.
Okay, that's fine.
So if you're conducting any kind of business, legally, you have to have a business license. Now, what,
And in
But-
fact, you would need the business license to get the rental license.
yeah, and don't we also
That's what
need
I'm trying to do.
isn't there also a city of Newcastle business license as well as a
Yes.
state of Delaware?
Yes.
So you'd have 2 business licenses and the rental license.
Good point.
Correct, yes. those stays.
And those only last a specific period of
A
time.
year, they're only
Yeah.
good for a year.
Yeah.
So I have approval process as one of my items here. I don't know that we can just necessarily get that today, but I'm gonna work with the town staff on sort of what we need to do to get that, you know, what's practical for submission of that.
Okay. So approval in order to get the short-term license or the rental?
The approval process, what we need to do,
Okay.
right? I'll work with city staff on what we need to do, or what the process is now, and make sure it's clear for those who want that. There was another there was another discussion about use limitations. And what I mean by use limitations is you can, and there are jurisdictions that do it, and they have been upheld. This is one thing I do know, because I found the cases on this. It says you can limit the number of days per year that a particular short-term rental may be rented, right? So different places use different times.
Done in Wilmington.
I found the cases that say it's, and again, I'm here to get your recommendation. Is there a recommendation that, do you wanna limit the number of days in any way, or do you wanna allow it to occur 365 days a year?
Based on this conversation, yes.
Okay. So what, go ahead, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I mean, if the current occupancy rate, I mean, what do you mean by limitations? Are you saying that, are you talking about the number of days, or are you talking about the types of usage?
Number of days. So for example, we had we've discussed a limitation about how many of these, I'm gonna call them businesses or Airbnbs or short-term rentals, sorry, how many of those can be within within the district, right? The second limitation you could put on there is you could say you can't be an Airbnb every day. You could only rent for 270 days, 180 days, 90 days, whatever that is. Is there an appetite from the planning commission to put some limitation on the number of days of use for a given year? The answer may be no. I just wanted to ask the question.
My concern is if you, depending on the number of days you limit, you might prevent the unit owner from making this profitable enough to have it.
What are the thoughts of the other members of the commission?
My thought with regards to the limitation on number of days you can rent, I think there should be some limitation, and I'm not sure what the limitation should be. But I think it should be different for a short-term rental versus bed and breakfast. I think bed and breakfast, just by its very nature.
By its nature, I would agree with you, that by its very nature would not have a limitation, so although my chart is yes, no on that, I absolutely agree. Is there a suggestion as to what the short-term rental limitation number should be?
I don't know, I don't have a recommendation for you, but I do know, like I said, our high season, so to speak, is relatively short, May through December, with really the warmer months really being our where we have the most tourism. So I think that in itself might kind of limit just the self-pleasing itself.
So what I'm gonna do with this is, there seems to be a desire, I'm trying to get through this, there seems to be a desire for some limitation, maybe not, when we ultimately vote on it, but I'm gonna draw it up with a blank, and we can talk about
I
it.
would say 60 to 90 days,
Okay.
because we're given all kinds of other permissions.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, what?
I just had a question. I mean, is this something that's easily trackable by the city, or would this incur a lot of work for the city to manage, like, how many nights?
I'm gonna give you a terrible answer, I don't know. And so that's something we'll probably have to discuss with the city staff. So, in my misspent life, I've done a lot of litigation over inspections. I will tell you that inspections are easiest when there's nobody in there the first time you use it, because my friend talked about the Fourth Amendment, and once somebody's in the building, you can't just go in there and inspect unless you have permission. With that being said, it would be my recommendation that you require, be it a bed and and breakfast or a short-term rental that's licensed as such be inspected for life, health, safety things before you
Before
can
the
get the
license.
license,
Yes.
right? Your fire extinguishers work, your plumbing work, there's nothing like that, so you do it.
It's
Um,
conditional.
It's a part of the license, that's correct. I think, and this is unfortunate, the more it's used, the more difficult it is, right? To sort of keep up, because if it's rented for 3 days and 3 days and 3 days and 3 days and 3 days, you're not gonna do a life safety inspection in between all of those. But it would be my recommendation that if you're, upon renewal of your license, especially for a short-term rental, that you would have a re-inspection by the city
Yes.
for life, health, safety. Does that, I see a lot of heads nodding yes,
Yeah,
right?
that's
Just to
fine.
make-
Cause if you're doing it annually, one of the things I'm thinking about is I know the state requires fire extinguishers in a business to be inspected. It might be twice a year, but at least if you're gonna do a fire inspection once a year, you'll at least get those things inspected to ensure they're in compliance. So if there's a fire, at least we know there's a working fire extinguisher there.
So, and I wanted to talk, because there was some discussion about fees that you charge and the city can make. The fee has to be reasonably proportionate to the cost of providing the services. So for example, if the city does a life, health, safety inspection and it costs the city $20, then you can charge $20 to recoup those costs. You can also recoup administrative costs and things like that. This is not and cannot be a money maker for the city, or therefore you get into an impermissible tax. So one of the things that we're going to do when we recommend that license fee is we're gonna look at what the costs are. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we'll recommend a fee that's proportionate to the cost of providing the services, depending on what you all recommend and what the council adopts.
I looked at that a lot. It's a typical price is $200. And I think that the idea there is that it's not just get the license, it's manage it throughout the year and deal with disruption, with issues, with fires, with collecting taxes, with collecting
Yeah,
other stuff.
there's a lot that goes into the fee. I've had the two major litigations over fees in the state, so I've got a pretty good handle on what can and cannot go in. But there is still some uncertainty in sort of what you can add in, largely police costs, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, well, that's why I made the list that I did in the last, is that it's not free for the city to do this.
That's correct,
And we
there's
have
no
to be
question
realistic
about
about
it.
it.
So,
Also, the more we have, the more a dedicated person will be required.
so with that, that was my get started, yes, no list, and I thank the members for indulging me in walking through that. From the commission standpoint, is there any other thing, at least as to the first draft, that you would like to see included?
Are you gonna do definitions, or how are you gonna write this?
I'm gonna write it and see how it writes, and then I'm gonna bring it to y'all, and we're gonna have another one of these discussions.
The reason I ask is that, the way that the, code is constructed today, there's a definition, just like a contract, and then there's conditions applied to the definition. Is that the approach you're gonna take?
Most likely, I'm gonna follow the format which is in the code, because it just makes it easier. And I'm gonna strike through, for example, tourist homes, new definition of a bed and breakfast, new definition of short-term rental, perhaps a definition of a rental property. We'll see. But I needed to get these big things together, so at least I have some idea of what's in your heads, so that therefore I can then go try to make a draft, right? And that draft is malleable. Again, I've tried to say from the very beginning, I will not get this right on the first try. I will not get this right on the second try, even if we pass it. The one thing about writing code for municipalities is the first thing that comes through is always the thing you missed. It's never perfect, so we'll do our best. We'll do our best.
Could you just reiterate for me the difference between a short-term rental and a bed and breakfast? Because I'm getting confused the way we're having this.
So
conversation.
that's gonna be within the definition.
Yeah, but I
okay.
mean, you tell me
I'm
now.
gonna try to take the Terry House as my base, and make that a
That's a bed and breakfast?
Yeah,
So a person renting a room out of their house is not a bed and breakfast?
correct. You guys can then tell me I'm wrong, and we could do it differently, but that's the way I'm looking at it at the moment. So that would be
It's
a
not the way
short-term
the
rental.
industry looks at it, just so you know. So, I mean, we could do anything we want here, but that is not how the industry looks at it.
Cynthia, I think, our solicitor knows how to develop a draft of a policy.
City Solicitor, would you please advise the
And
I'm not-
fellow council member that he is not to reprimand me in public? I would appreciate that.
We're not reprimanding anybody, and and personal disputes aside, I just can't do it today. So, Madam Chair, I have gotten what I need to at least come up with a start of a draft for public consumption.
Thank you.
And so I'm gonna turn it back over to you, and I believe we're there for public comment.
Yes, we. Oh, what happened?
Try this one.
Oh, that was working. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, so public comment, each person can have 3 minutes. And, please ensure that your comments are only, concerning the items on the agenda. If it's something not on this topic, then you can save it for another meeting. So, is there a pad for them to put their name?
Yes.
Okay. If you would like to go up and fill out your name, and can somebody start their timer?
I have it right here.
Oh, okay, good, we got the big one. Do we have anybody who wants to make any public comments? And if you could please state your name and address.
My name is Carol Bukolich. I live at 33 The Strand. I don't know if these are public comments, but my request is that in the future, it would be helpful if the audience had copies of what it is that the commissioners are going to be reviewing, particularly for the next session. That seems especially important because it sounds like you're going to be talking about specific kinds of details. I also had I've done, like Cynthia, I guess, a lot of reading of what is talked about around short-term rentals. And I'm confused by the definition that Max is proposing, because in all of the literature, short-term rentals are tourist homes or whole homes, and bed and breakfasts, which are rooms rented out when the owner is in the home. So to have something different than that seems a little odd. And then also, there's talk about what's gonna be required for a license. Most of the things that I looked at also suggested that the person who was doing the operation of the tourist home or the bed and breakfast had to have liability insurance, and the typical is a $1 million policy. And it seems to me that's not something you necessarily look at when you go to investigate the place, but it certainly is something that I think people need to know, that the city is not responsible if somebody falls down your stairs or if there's a fire and heaven forbid someone is hurt. So those are my comments.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Max, you might not have heard that, but it was, put a condition on that the renter needs to have insurance and then coverage to indefinitely.
No pen.
There's no pen up. Do we have a pen?
I did not hear that, thank you.
Yeah, we all think that's important.
My name's Bill Emery, I live out in Bolton. First, any of you guys ever stayed at a B&B? No?
Of course we have.
Pardon me?
Of course I have.
Good for you. And, well, I've stayed at them. It's funny, coincidental. I have a T-shirt I'm wearing tonight from Salem, Massachusetts. I go up there every year when Halloween falls on a weekend, 3 times, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So I go up there 3 times on years when it's on there on a weekend. B&B's up there. They've got probably 24 B&B's up there. B&B's are like a hotel. You rent a night out. Maybe, consequently, this Halloween I'll be up there for 4 nights. You rent them out for nights. You don't go and stay at B&B for 3 weeks, 4 weeks. They're by the night, typically, like I said, 4 nights. You don't stay there for a month, 2 months. That's not what you do there. They're not short-term rentals. You want to do that, you rent a home out for a short term, 30 days, 60 days. You're renting a home, not a B&B for that. B&Bs are for towns like Salem, Colonial Newcastle, Colonial Williamsburg, Charleston. Do you want tourists to come to Newcastle? Yes? Do you want tourists in Newcastle? The problem with Newcastle is most of the people in Newcastle don't want tourists. I probably make a lot of enemies by saying that. The people in Newcastle, they don't want tourists in Newcastle. And I'll tell you right now, I don't think the Planning Commission wants tourists in Newcastle. And they're proving it. They don't want B&Bs in Newcastle. One of the examples is what they're trying to say right now about parking. No parking they only want off-street parking. You and everybody here knows there's no off-street parking in Newcastle. The only parking you got is on the street. I'm in favor of B&Bs because I'm in favor of tourists in Newcastle. I've lived here for 67 years. And the only parking you have is on-street parking except for a handful of off-street parking in Old Newcastle, unless you live out of town. And the B&Bs will help bring tourists in, then let them. If you want to limit the numbers, fine, let it. But you have to allow off-street parking. And if you don't want to allow off-street parking, then the Terry House doesn't have off-street parking. And it can't be allowed. There's no favoritism. If you can't allow anybody else to have it, then the Terry House can't have it. No favoritism. That's another problem in this town. There's too much favoritism going around behind closed door dealings and things. But if you can't allow off-street parking, then they don't have it either. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Ken Edgerton, I'm with the Terry House, one member of the Terry House. This is an I don't like discussion. I don't like this thing. I propose we have an I don't like any door that's not black. Let's tax those people. I'd also point out that there's a lot of people in this room. I heard many members of the board that were getting shut down tonight. Their ideas weren't being heard. Please speak up. Please speak up. Let's get everybody's opinion out here. I don't know if you've seen the Terry House. It's becoming more and more beautiful. It's becoming something that the town can be proud of. But guys, it's not going to be available to the public anymore. If it gets taxed to death. Thank you.
Excuse me, sir, can you sign in?
Sorry?
Can you sign in, please?
Yes.
Yeah, just name and address, please.
I'm John Reeves, East 2nd Street, 52nd. I did prepare a presentation in case you want to pass it around. That's interesting. I do want to thank,
You need to speak in the mic.
I'm sorry. I do want to thank Cynthia and Stephen for excellent presentations that I think really lay out the issues and for a really interesting conversation in terms of all the different issues. So a lot of the points I noted down were discussed and brought out, so sort of cut most of this. I do want to talk about the idea of trying to do some local research. I think many times issues came up and people said, well, we don't know what's really going on. And I think the off-the-shelf research from other communities is interesting, but not necessarily relevant. It's just too different a town. So I think we need to do some local research. It doesn't need to take forever, but we need to sort of find out what's really happening in town in terms of short-term rentals, on all sides, from the Terry House to the Strand, to the historical districts and so forth. So, and for example, I think Stephen made this point, and I agree from my conversations, the Airbnbs and the short-term rentals at Terry House are not wildly popular. So wildly profitable, So the idea that there's going to be this tidal wave of Airbnbs and so forth, tidal wave of short-term rentals happening, is really just not likely. It's just not realistic. In fact, what I would challenge the Planning Commission to do is to say, are we, for example, the government function that wants to encourage short-term rentals? If we want to encourage an economic environment that fosters the things that residents want, the stores, the restaurants, the arts and culture, and so forth, that supports the historical society, that supports the restaurants we like to eat in. We do need more tourism. There is in fact a tourism problem because particularly a problem in terms of consistency throughout the year. In conversations I had, people lose money in January, they lose money in February, they lose money in the middle of the week, basically, because it's nice to have one or two large events, but they're losing money. So what is the function of government that encourages short-term rentals in order to encourage tourism? And is that something that the Planning Commission is willing to do? Thanks very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, where's the sign-in sheet?
John, did you take the sign?
You want to go back? I guess he said nobody else could talk after that.
I stole the pen too.
Okay, thank you. Ron Stack, 104 East 3rd Street in the Historic District. As I reflected on what I wanted to say during my allotted precious 3 minutes tonight, I kept coming back to something I read recently. It was the comment of a resident in Berlin, Maryland. Council members there recently passed an ordinance requiring short-term rentals in their residential districts to be owner-occupied after a contentious difference of opinion among townspeople. Paraphrasing the individual, he or she said quite simply, I live in a residential neighborhood. I expect it to be residential. Newcastle is not unlike Berlin, Barcelona, Charleston, and hundreds of more places as they wrestle with the potential consequences of legislation. It seems there are roughly 2 diverging opinions in Newcastle on this same issue of short-term rentals, which are businesses. Here, there are those who favor a less regulated approach to allow them pretty much anywhere in town, and there are those who don't, with some variations. I am one of those who don't. I strongly favor B&Bs, inns, or short-term rentals and would support them 200% in the commercial district, but I don't think they belong in residential areas. Why? Because I want to be able to see Champ, our neighbor's beagle, when he's barking to make sure everything's okay. Because I love hearing the delightful squeal of the little girls next door playing in the yard most of the time. Because I take pride and comfort knowing the names of at least the faces of those who live around me. And I know that they would be there in a heartbeat if something suspicious happened to our house while we were away. Because I know neighbors would call me out if I did something reckless, illegal, or damaging. Sure, we may not all like each other or agree on everything, but there is an invaluable sense that we all care and want to protect our homes in the neighborhood where most of us live all the time, every day, year after year. Commissioners, if you already haven't made up your mind, I ask you to consider this and think about your own home and neighborhood. Then think about the perceived short-term financial, political, or economic benefits a less regulated approach would yield. Consider the risk to residents like yourselves who live here for the long run and who love their neighborhoods. Imagine you were the homeowner of 50 years in Berlin who found an Airbnb occupant attempting to wrestle one of his pets in his yard. It only takes one incident like that to destroy trust in the neighborhood, community, and local government. Does that make me NIMBY, or old-fashioned, or fuddy-duddy, as some have characterized me and others? Maybe, but I'll risk that label any day to protect the most precious asset this city has, its neighborhoods, and the people who live in them. Keep residential areas residential. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is David Brundage. The issue here today is how much regulation should be made for independent businesses in the Newcastle, both historic district, both residential and commercial, such as a homemade home made into a so-called bed and breakfast, short-term rental, or potentially a car repair garage or a small lumber yard. Right now, the historic residential district is a potential free-for-all. When something like a third of all dwellings here in Newcastle are rentals, there are not a lot of owners actually residing in town. There are always differences of opinion, but this is not a fight, as some have felt. The issue is to create regulations that protect residents against potential abuse or exploitation. Just because nothing has happened of any big consequence yet does not predict the future. Some have said Newcastle is not that interesting or too small to be of much interest. That's not the point. To be sure for the future that our residential district remains residential, we must have proper regulations established that protect our neighbors and allow limited or even no commercial use. My home is on a strand at Hackett Alley. My back fence abuts a dwelling now being rented for transient visitors. The location is rather problematic with a narrow alley that only can act with the only access and limited parking there or on the street. For any other home in Newcastle, it might be somewhat easier to set up transient rental use. The best option is to keep all commercial establishments in the commercial area, Delaware Street. So I ask the commission members and all those now here in attendance, do you desire a short-term rental over your fence? If you have children, do you want to constantly supervise their exposure to strangers? Do you want potential vandalism or loud and late parties next door? Good regulations must be determined that are appropriate to our lovely historic residential district. Please make it so.
Thank you. I missed your name.
I'm sorry?
I missed your name.
David Brundage.
David Brundage, thank you.
Gross, 1301 13th Street. I made a list, starting with tourist terms should be 90 days or less. So that the 90 days, like you were referring to, family issues, they want to stay in the area, nurses, professionals. So I think 90 days is a good distinction. Insurance. I run many groups, and one of the things with rentals, you can look at insurance policies and they have specific levels according to how many days a house is rented. So that is specified, Max. Rental license, again, so it's not a money grab, should be the same as a 1 year, 2 year regular license that the city already issues, so that it's a level playing field. Definitely should limit percentage or number, whether it's residential or commercial area. Parking must be limited to one vehicle. I don't know how in the heck, if you rent 5 rooms in a house, you're gonna have 5 cars. That just is a numerical impossibility, especially in the residential area. So I think there's gotta be distinction on parking limits there as well. Tax, rental tax, without a doubt, there's got to be. If it's 1%, 2% minimal, and your startup and your costs, as it's been said many times, it's expensive to manage. No, it absolutely isn't. If you run a business, have run a business, or are business oriented, you can figure out what the cost is for startup, and then yearly your cost, to come up with a fair amount that you're not gouging people. Noise ordinance, extremely important. You get 1 warning or 2 warnings, whatever you decide, but that's a must. No RVs or boats. They can be put by the War Memorial and walk the few blocks. And keep residential, residential, keep commercial, commercial. People love their town, love their houses, and want responsibility. They don't want people just jumping in, and like was previously said, I wouldn't want my kids, you know, running around, riding a bike with people transient just coming in and going around. Lastly, any existing B&B, short-term, whatever, tourist homes must abide and follow by whatever new ordinances this group puts together. No exceptions.
Thank you, Bill.
Hi everyone, my name's James. I know that was my lovely father that everyone met recently. His name's Ken Hendrickson. I own the Terry house. It's actually under my name, but it is a family ordeal. My dad is out there helping me. My brother helps me. My mom helps me. And my lovely fiance helps decorate everything. So you just met my dad. You might have seen him laying brick with my brother in the backyard or doing various work around the place. We are a small family-owned business that have put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into the place. Man, it has been hard. After 2 years and spending over $400,000 in renovations, after all that hard work, man, it looks good. We would love to have any of you come stay with us if you would ever like and see the place. We would be honored. One thing I would say that I noticed a lot of the members have been trying to separate the Terry House from other Airbnbs. Terry House can't be anything other than a hotel or a bed and breakfast. It is a 10-bed, 10-bath commercial property, and it is zoned historical commerce. It's really all it could be and all it could ever be. It has been a place for people to stay over 100 years, and I hope it'll be like that for another 100. So many memories for people to have been made there, and we are hoping to bring so many more. So let's keep the Terry House as a central location for people to visit the town. It is zoned historical commerce, it is in the commercial district, and is in the center of the town. Let's share this wonderful town with everyone. and the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would agree with the last speaker.
Your
that the-
name and address, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, Sally Denton, and I live on Second Street. I would agree with the last speaker, the Terry House has never looked so nice. And, it's a great place, and it's a great place, I've had family members stay there. I feel that the Airbnbs should be, as other people have said, in the commercial district, not in a residential area. People that buy homes in any residential area, that's what they're buying a home in. They're not buying a home where there's a residential, where there's gonna be somebody there on off weekends or days of the week, and the coming and the going. And someone else mentioned, I'm not sure who it was, I live down towards the Bull Hill area. There is no parking down there at night. So it's just not there. So that if people come to visit the town, they would need to park down, and a lot of people don't know this, but where the old recycle bins used to be. And that's quite a walk to downtown. And to walk the sidewalks, it's very, very dangerous. You would have to walk in the street. So I'd highly encourage you to vote against, or however you go, limiting an Airbnb in the residential area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anybody else? Do I have any? Oh, okay.
Hi everybody, I'm Dwayne Foster. I live at 206 Delaware Street. I run a B&B on Packet Alley, as many of you may know, probably all of you know. I also run a B&B across my alley on Delaware Street. Both have been very nice, well received, amazing people that have stayed there. A lot of comments about how beautiful our town is. A lot of repeat visitors. I had a person stay for the third time actually. In a year and a half, which was pretty cool. She couldn't book actually this time, unfortunately, because it was already booked. She comes to visit her sister who's ill. She comes from California, and it's always nice to stay in town, she says. My hope with this whole process is that we have a solution, and it's an agreed upon solution, and we can just get over this. There's a lot of contention between residents and division, and that's not what we need right now. We need to come together and support each other like a true community. That's why I moved here, and that's what I strive to do with being on the senior center board, block party, bring people together. I feel really horrible that this has come to this with, obviously, I think the reason is because I opened a B&B on Packet Alley. I know that's why this all came. That was not what my intention was to do, was to divide people by doing this. It was to bring people to town, to show how special this place is. And to create jobs. Like, I own a restaurant and I'm able to employ a bunch of people. Most of them live in town. I was able to give another person another job by opening a B&B on Packet Alley. I don't make money off of this. This is purely a venture, and you know what? So what if I did? Do I not have the right to make money like all of you? I'm trying to build wealth like you have through your lives. That's why you own these beautiful homes on the Strand. I deserve that right as well. And doing so, preserving our community as well. I'm not trying to degrade the community. I care about this place. And if that's not obvious to you at this point, I don't know what else I can say. So thank you. I hope everything will go well. I'm sure it will, and we can move past this. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Everybody likes that pen.
One.
No, you only get one. Sorry, you're just limited to a total of 3 minutes.
Hi, I'm Patty Isaac Hansen. I live at 49 The Strand. I support commercial, but I do not want any commercial business in the residential area. Like people said, I bought the place, I want to be at home, I want to know my neighbors, and I don't want transient people around. And that's all I have to say. I'm all for whatever people want to do in the commercial area, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, this is your last chance. All right, we got a few things emailed in. I'm gonna try to read them. So please bear with me. From
Trade off if you want, you read some, I read the ones up to you.
It's up to you, lost your link.
Huh? That's true, you got my mic.
From Dennis Young, I am currently in Charleston, South Carolina, not likely making it to the meeting tonight after arrival in Baltimore. I want to register my protest against any advancement of a city tax imposed on any short-term rental or rented rooms within our immediate city boundaries. I view such a tax as an encumbrance on those businesses already dealing with adverse consequences of pandemic closings and accumulated financial pressures of expenses not forgiven by the forced closings. Also, there is the continued effect of inflation and now the reassessments of property values that surely are the first step to raising taxes, certainly local school taxes. Additionally, imposing taxes sends a warning to a small business as well as to parties interested in relocating to Newcastle, and many people express the desire to do so. It has been publicly stated that downtown businesses are in it for the money and make out well. This is a biased opinion, more likely exposing a rush to judgment and an us versus them parochial security. Lastly, for years there's been an understandable preference for a portion of this community to preserve Newcastle as a bedroom community and to wall off the city from people who wish to visit and spend some time here in ways that might be novel or maybe disruptive of the comfort of the status quo. I am reminded of the intentional lack of facilities for personal watercraft at our dock. One only has to look at the colonial river town, Chestertown, Maryland, to see that their docks and their accessibility to tourists renders the town enjoyable, attracting, and successful at being overrun and lowering the quality of life for residents. The direction our governing bodies might take is how to creatively promote more business and attractions to enhance the experiences of living in and visiting our town, and not to institute speed bumps and punitive financial burdens on our business of any sort. Okay, that was a mouthful. It's only water. This one's from Barbara Winter. I believe that while short-term rentals might be limited by the city council, they could certainly add value to the town and benefit businesses. Okay. Dear Chair and members of Planning Commission, we were in Europe this winter and spent 2 weeks in Uzes, population 8,300. This is pretty long, so I'm gonna try to get through it.
year when we return in the off-season, there are fewer restaurants and shops open and far fewer people walking the old cobblestone pedestrian streets. Our friend who lives there full-time told us that so many homes have become short-term rentals that there are not enough residents in the off-season to support local businesses. We drove up, and I'm not even gonna try to pronounce this name, to another city one day. It was like a ghost town. We didn't find one restaurant open for lunch, but we passed few people on the street. At the Chateau Ruin were a group of grade school children with teachers and 4 tourists on bicycles. Only one tasting room was open. The 4th generation young winemaker told us that all the vendors now go to wine markets during the off-season because there's no visitors in the town, and few locals can afford to live there. Our own historic center is, of course, neither of these places, but if a town oozing with charm and antiquity, known worldwide for producing the finest wines in France and arguably in the world, can feel like a ghost town during the months without tourists, our sweet, delicate little gem is surely not immune. I cannot believe you do not love this place and appreciate its unique and special qualities as much as I do. They are remnants of the past, but are also visions of the future, as urban planners today are recommending exactly what we already have as the very elements that must be incorporated into future livable communities. Thank you, Eleanor Kenton. Okay. I think that's all of them. So,
Madam Chair, I'd just like to clean up one thing. There's nothing in this ordinance that deals with taxing of.
I know.
There's no taxing whatsoever. I wanna make that clear. That's come up 2 or 3 times.
Okay.
It's, for clarity, it's because it was presented as an option to city council, and was, put on hold in the last city council meeting. So I think that's what people are responding to. A whole series of potential taxes were.
I just wanted to make it very clear that
It's not this.
It's not this
Yes.
bill.
Okay, our next meeting is gonna be April 28th. I mean, technically, we would've had a meeting in 2 weeks. I know Max isn't gonna be able to get anything done in that time. So, our next meeting will be April 28th. It costs money for us to have a meeting in this room versus in the free room at the police. And the planning commission doesn't have a budget, so.
We could probably get these guys to donate a few bucks. What is it, $250 to be here? How much does it cost to be here?
Yeah, but we don't need donations.
So, if you could give us an indication ahead of time, if you think you're gonna come, so we know whether to rent the room. I don't wanna rent a room to find 5 people in here. So I just appreciate that, cause we wanna make good use of your tax dollars. So
We have a show of hands right now. Who's coming to the next meeting? Okay, I think you got your answer.
Okay, we'll then have to confirm that the room and everything's available on the 28th. Okay. Does anybody have any further business? Are we all ready to go home?
I just want to say one thing. I think that,
Can you speak into your mic, Vicky?
oh, I'm sorry, yeah. She took my mic, you know.
Oh, you gave it away.
Oh, that is true. This is just for, commission business, but this has been talked about in other commissions as well, Max. I think, all the commissions I serve on could use another FOIA education. So if you're doing one for the university or something, can you tune us in or think about that? So we've got a lot of commissioners.
I hate teaching FOIA, but I'm happy
bet
to
you
do
do.
it. I teach it every month, it seems. So, but
If you do it every month, let us
I'm
dial in.
happy to do. I'm happy to do it. I do it for different communities.
All right,
across.
well, if we can dial into one, let us know. We'll be quiet, just listen.
Very good.
I just wanted to say, I'm happy to write a check for $250 to rent the room. What?
Do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Do I have a second?
Kristen?
All in favor? Opposed? Meeting's adjourned.